Hi everybody. That's going to be difficult to follow. I do want to just sort of in general just kind of thank everybody that's presented throughout the last couple of days. This community is so incredibly generous with your experience, whether it be personal or technical or bridging the gap between the two. And I always find it really great to kind of see that. So this is going to be kind of going in a little bit of a slightly different direction. So my talk is called Thinking Beyond Critique, and the critique is in quotes because I am not in any way trying here to say that critique is an inadequate thing and we need to move beyond it. The idea here is that sort of critique as a part of the design process, when we use that term, it might actually mean a lot of different things, and so that's kind of what I want to talk about today. So a couple of years ago, back I did this remotely, I did a talk called, they're very excited, Observations on Teaching Critique as a Design Skill. And basically the idea here was that in my map design class, I explicitly teach a methodology for participating in critique that I think makes the experience more productive, because a lot of times people kind of come into critique and they learn it by example and often by bad example. So the sort of the approach that I presented was this idea of critique as a collaborative process, right? So you have your group of people who are going to provide that feedback to the designer, and sort of the goal there, from my perspective, is to have it be sort of conversational, have it be sort of the idea of not this sort of top-down idea of you should change this, you should change that, but this idea of trying to get the design, the work of the designer to be the best version of that designer's vision as possible. And so I talked about a number of sort of different guidance that I give to both the people that are providing the critique, but also the people who are receiving the critique. And some of the things that I talked about there was, remember that it's the designer's vision that we're trying to sort of help develop, and that means that sometimes the designer is allowed to just not take your advice. And I think that was really important. And I get a lot of positive feedback for with that presentation, but I also got some things where people would say, well, when I'm having a critique with my boss or my client, and they say you should make that line weight heavier or something specific like that, I have to do it, right? I can't not do that because it's my boss to tell me what to do. And so it kind of creeped into my head, and just sort of thinking, is this sort of collaborative approach, is it realistic, right? Because there is that sort of thing out there where, like, okay, yeah, you have that conversation with your boss, you got to do what your boss says, right? So that's not necessarily this kind of collaborative experience. Wait, I went backwards. There we go. So the question is that realistic, right? After thinking about it, my answer was yes, absolutely. It is very much realistic. I do it all the time, right? But my answer is also sometimes, because ultimately critique is a big umbrella, right? We use this word to mean a lot of different types of interactions that we have. For example, that conversation that you have with your boss in the office about your design is not the same thing as the conversation that you'll have with colleagues over a beer outside of work, even if that colleague that you're talking to is your boss. The context is different, right? The dynamics are different. And so I sort of thought about this a little bit more. I came up with the question, this is important, right? It's important to have a productive critique experience for the people that are involved to understand what the dynamics are, right? What kind of critique interaction are you actually having? And so how do we recognize this, right? So I've thought about this a lot. And so I've identified purely from my experience, and this is not sort of deep research, but my experience for probably about 30 years of participating in critiques in different environments, what I consider to be distinct critique interactions. So the first one is peer critique, right? And that's the thing that I was talking about, that I talk about with my class, right? And this is characterized by the idea that the critic, the person who's giving that feedback, does not have a direct stake in the success of that design, right? We want it to be successful for the sake of the designer, and certainly for the sake of the designer's audience. But at the end of the day, our name is not on it, right? It's not our work. And so, again, the idea here is that when we provide that feedback, it's to try to create the best version of the designer's design, right? Sometimes we may kind of try to nudge their vision a little bit if we don't think that their current vision is necessarily in line with the overall objectives of that map. But those comments that we make are suggestions, right? They're not demands. We have to accept that that person is going to have the freedom to say, this is not what I want my design to accomplish. And this is different from what I would call direction, right? So when you have that conversation with your boss or your client where they have a direct stake in that product that you're designing, right? Your boss has a boss, right? Your client has customers or readers or some other audience, right? The work as it's presented at the end of the day reflects on them, not just the designer, right? And so the purpose of this is to bring that design in line with the view of the critic, less so than the designer, right? And this can be really frustrating for the designer because, as we all know, that vision can shift and change and evolve as we go. And in this case, in general, those comments are going to be demands rather than suggestions. Your boss says, make the line weight heavier, just make the line weight heavier, right? This might need to be negotiable, right? So you might be able to say, well, if I make the line weight heavier, it's going to have these other knock-on effects. Maybe that's not a good idea. But at the end of the day, your boss, your client says, make the line weight heavier. Just make the damn line weight heavier, right? You don't really have a choice. So this is different, again, still from what I would call assessment, right? And as a teacher, I do this all the time, right? Somebody submits an assignment to me, I have a set of expectations, right? Does that student skillfully apply the concepts and techniques that I've taught them, right? And I'm always comparing against that preset expectation. If they do something beyond that, outside of what they taught them, that's great. But what we're looking at is saying, did they do this to my satisfaction based on what I taught them, right? Did they apply those skills? So the feedback in most cases here is sort of after the fact, right? This is not a case where we're most likely going to have the student continue to iterate over that design, right? Sometimes there'll be a subsequent assignment specifically to iterate over that, but it's basically, you got this grade, this is why you got this grade, these are the things that you can improve on, right? We see this all the time. Also, I teach in a landscape architecture department, and our students often have professional critique reviews, right? Somebody out in the professional field looks at their portfolio and says, based on the structure, based on the material that's included, and based on the quality of the material that's included, is this a professional portfolio, right? Will this actually get you a job at a firm like the one that I work at, right? They're probably never going to see that portfolio again, but what they're saying is, this is what professional expectations are. This is how your portfolio fits within that or doesn't, and in what ways it does or does not. So I also think about analysis, sort of, and or review. And in this case, right, so I think that the main factor here is that the audience for these comments is not the designer themselves, right? So if you write a book review, you review a ballet, you do a review of an atlas or something like that, the idea there isn't here, I created a list of comments and I'm going to give it to the designer by way of this audience, right? It's for this audience, so this audience understands how this piece of work is effective, right? And a lot of times what we're doing here is kind of deconstructing the design decisions, how effectively they were applied, and sort of building that back up to see how did all of those decisions apply, sort of combine to lead to the success or failure of the final product, right? But the key thing here is that the audience of a review is generally not going to be the designer themselves. So it's a different interaction. And the last one that I'm going to sort of talk about is testing, right? And so obviously this is something that happens in cartography fairly regularly, right? So we do this in a very formal way. We may have a series of test users, and we might say, all right, here are a list of map reading tasks that I want you to be able to perform using this mask or this map, and we're going to test, like, how efficiently can they perform those tasks, right? Do they understand the pattern that we're trying to communicate? Can they navigate from one location to another? This also happens informally, and I think this is important that we that we don't necessarily take as seriously, where, say you've designed a trail map for a park, right? And somebody comes up to you, and they know that you designed the trail map, and they tell you, I used your map, and I couldn't use it to navigate. I got lost, right? It was very, very hard to understand. It was very hard to orient where I was. And that's important to understand, right? You know, ultimately, this testing idea is about does the thing do what we expect it to do, right? And a lot of these other sort of critique ideas, right, those interactions, are based on what do we think should work, right? So based on best practices, based on our personal experience, based on theory, what do we think should work? But none of that really matters if it doesn't work. So I think these testing interactions are really especially important. So I also want to point out, these are interactions that I've identified because of the types of experience that I've had, right? The type of experience that you have is going to vary, right? You may have things that have characteristics of 2 or more of these, right? Or you may have very, very different interactions based on the kind of work that you're doing, right? And what you want your users and your colleagues, your participants in your critique interactions to actually get out of that work. So what's the sort of upshot? What's the important takeaway here? So for me, it's just to bear in mind that when we talk about critique, it's not just one thing, right? That there are a variety of different interactions that we could be talking about, even we're calling them all critique. The names of these kinds of interactions that I've talked about, or even the act of naming them, I don't think is important. I think it's just important to recognize that there are different types of interactions with different dynamics, and for those interactions to be productive and satisfying for everybody involved, we need to recognize that, and we need to kind of establish what are the parameters, right? What are the dynamics of that interaction? Because if we don't, that's where friction comes in, right? That's where the overbearing critic rears his ugly head. That's where the defensive designer rears their ugly head. But I think that this works much more effectively if these parameters are kind of established ahead of time. So that's it. Yeah, so I don't have time for questions, but I will be around if you have any questions. And thanks for your time and your attention.